Sergeant Eric Thompson had learned to trust his dog's instincts without question. Rex, his black Labrador retriever, had been his service dog for 3 years, since Eric returned from Afghanistan with injuries both visible and invisible. The IED that had taken his left leg below the knee had been merciful compared to what it had done to his mind. The blast had killed 2 of his brothers instantly, Corporal Jenkins, who'd been walking point, and Private First Class Rodriguez, who'd been just 20 years old with a pregnant wife back home. Eric had been third in line, close enough to the explosion to lose his leg, but far enough to survive when the others hadn't. The physical recovery had been brutal but straightforward. 9 surgeries, 18 months of rehabilitation, learning to walk again with a prosthetic that chafed and ached and never quite felt like part of his body. But the mental wounds were deeper, more insidious. The traumatic brain injury left him with memory gaps, difficulty concentrating, and headaches that could drop him to his knees. The PTSD turned everyday sounds, car backfires, fireworks, even dropped dishes, into triggers that sent him diving for cover or spiraling into panic attacks. Peaceful sleep became a distant memory, replaced by nightmares where he relived the explosion over and over, watching his brothers die while he survived for no reason he could understand. Rex helped him navigate both challenges with patience and unwavering dedication. The dog had been trained to detect the subtle physiological changes that preceded Eric's panic attacks: elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, the slight tremor in his hands, and would alert him minutes before the attack hit, giving Eric time to employ coping strategies or remove himself from triggering situations. Rex provided stability support when Eric's prosthetic made walking difficult, allowing Eric to rest weight on the dog's sturdy frame during physical therapy sessions or particularly challenging terrain. Most importantly, Rex offered companionship during the long, dark hours when the nightmares came screaming in at 3 in the morning, when Eric woke drenched in sweat and shaking, convinced he could still smell burning metal and flesh. They were walking through the Veterans Memorial Park in small-town Fairfax, Virginia, on a crisp November morning when everything changed. The park had become their daily ritual, a peaceful loop around the pond where Eric could clear his head before facing the challenges of another day. The routine was important for Eric's recovery, his therapist said. Structure, predictability, gentle exercise, fresh air, all components of healing from trauma. The park opened at dawn, and Eric and Rex were usually among the first visitors, arriving just as the sun broke over the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cold enough to see their breath, temperatures hovering just above freezing, and fallen leaves crunched satisfyingly under Eric's boots and prosthetic. The prosthetic always ached more in cold weather, the residual limb more sensitive to temperature changes. But Eric had learned to push through the discomfort. Other early risers, mostly fellow veterans and elderly people who appreciated the park's quiet morning hours, nodded respectfully as they passed, recognizing Eric's military bearing and Rex's distinctive service dog vest with its patches and identifications. Rex walked perfectly at Eric's left side, matching his pace automatically, adjusting when Eric's prosthetic made his gait uneven. The dog's attention was typically distributed between Eric and their surroundings, constantly monitoring both his handler's physical state and the environment for potential threats or triggers. But this morning, approximately halfway through their usual circuit, Rex's behavior changed dramatically. The dog suddenly stopped dead in his tracks, his entire body going rigid with attention. His ears pricked forward, pointing like radar dishes towards something in the far corner of the parking lot. Eric stopped automatically, following Rex's gaze, trying to see what had captured his dog's attention so completely. The parking lot was mostly empty at this early hour, just a few cars belonging to other morning visitors scattered across the asphalt. Rex's attention had fixed on something partially hidden behind overgrown hedges that bordered the parking area, thick stands of privet and forsythia that the park maintenance crew had been meaning to trim for months but never quite got around to. Behind those hedges, barely visible, sat an old car. Eric had probably walked past it dozens of times over the past 3 years without really registering its presence. It was one of those things you see so often you stop actually seeing it, just part of the landscape, invisible through familiarity. The vehicle was a sedan from the 80s by the look of it, a boxy shape that marked it as from an era before aerodynamic design became standard. It sat at an odd angle, listing slightly to one side, where the tires had completely deflated and partially rotted away. The car was covered in a thick layer of dirt, pollen, and organic debris from the overhanging trees. Windows were clouded with grime, making it impossible to see inside. Rust had eaten through the lower door panels and wheel wells, creating ragged holes that exposed the hollow interior. Dead leaves and wind-blown trash had accumulated around the base of the vehicle, and the encroaching hedges had begun growing over and through parts of the car, as if nature was slowly reclaiming it. The park maintenance crew probably kept meaning to have it towed, Eric thought, but bureaucracy moved slowly. Maybe there was a dispute about who owned it, or paperwork that needed processing, or maybe everyone just assumed someone else was handling it. Either way, the car had been there long enough to become part of the scenery, forgotten and ignored by everyone who passed by. Everyone except Rex. The dog was now pulling hard on his leash, something he never did. Rex's training had been exhaustive. 2 full years at one of the premier service dog facilities in California, where Eric had been matched with him shortly after his medical discharge from the Marines. Rex had spent those 2 years learning to detect panic attacks through minute physiological changes, to provide stability support for mobility-impaired handlers, to wake handlers from nightmares using gentle pressure and licking rather than sharp barks that might worsen trauma responses, to create space in crowds by positioning his body between his handler and other people. His obedience was absolute, his focus unwavering, his ability to ignore distractions legendary among the trainers who'd worked with him. But now Rex was straining toward that abandoned car with an intensity Eric had never witnessed, whining deep in his throat in a way that made the hair on the back of Eric's neck stand up. The whining was high-pitched, urgent, desperate even, not the normal alert sounds Rex made when detecting an oncoming panic attack or spotting a potential trigger in the environment. This was something different entirely, something that spoke of distress and need and overwhelming compulsion. Rex's whole body trembled with urgency that bordered on desperation, his muscles bunched and tense, his breathing rapid and shallow. His claws dug into the asphalt, seeking purchase as he pulled toward the car with strength that caught Eric off guard. For a dog trained to walk calmly beside wheelchairs and walkers, to never pull or strain, this behavior was unprecedented and deeply alarming. "Rex, heel," Eric commanded, using the firm, authoritative tone that always brought immediate compliance. It was a tone he'd learned in the Marines, a tone that conveyed absolute expectation of obedience. But the dog ignored him completely, acting as if Eric hadn't spoken at all. Rex pulled harder, his entire body leaning into the leash, his whining growing louder and more insistent. The sound was starting to attract attention from other park visitors, who glanced over with curiosity and concern. Eric tightened his grip on the leash, his palm already burning from the friction of Rex's pulling. "Rex, what's gotten into you? Heel! Now!" But his commands fell on deaf ears. Rex was completely fixated on that abandoned car, every fiber of his being focused on reaching it, as if his life, or someone else's life, depended on it. Then, before Eric could react or prepare, Rex lunged with explosive force. The leash, made of sturdy nylon designed to handle the strength of a large working dog, slipped through Eric's fingers before he could tighten his hold. The sudden movement caught Eric off balance, and he stumbled slightly on his prosthetic, nearly falling before catching himself with a sharp intake of breath. "Rex!" Eric shouted, genuine alarm in his voice now, but the dog didn't even glance back. Rex sprinted across the parking lot at full speed, his powerful legs eating up the distance in seconds, completely abandoning every bit of training and discipline that had defined his entire working life. Eric watched in shock and growing concern as his perfectly trained service dog, the animal he trusted with his life and mental health, bolted away from him as if possessed by some urgent mission that transcended all training, all commands, all bonds of obedience. Eric followed as quickly as his prosthetic would allow, his gait uneven and increasingly painful as he tried to move faster than his artificial limb was designed for. Each step sent small jolts of discomfort through his residual limb, the socket chafing against skin that was already tender from the morning's walk. The distance that Rex had covered in mere seconds took Eric nearly a full minute, each step a reminder of what that IED had taken from him, of the limitations he still struggled to accept 3 years after the explosion. By the time Eric reached the car, his breathing was labored and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold morning air. Rex was already at the driver's side door, pawing frantically at the rusted metal, whining and barking in genuine distress. The dog's claws left fresh scratches in the faded paint, exposing brighter metal underneath the oxidized surface. Rex's behavior had escalated beyond anything Eric had ever witnessed, not just urgent but frantic, almost panicked, as if time was running out for something critically important. Eric bent down beside Rex, wincing as his prosthetic made the movement awkward and painful. He placed a calming hand on the dog's back, trying to soothe him with touch and voice. "Easy, boy, easy now. What is it? What's got you so worked up?" His hand could feel Rex's rapid heartbeat through his coat, could feel the trembling that ran through the dog's entire body. This wasn't normal alerting behavior for a panic attack or environmental trigger. This was something else entirely, something that had overwhelmed 3 years of training and discipline. But Eric's words had no effect whatsoever. Rex's distress only intensified at the sound of Eric's voice, as if Eric's presence confirmed that they were in the right place, but that Eric wasn't moving fast enough, wasn't understanding the urgency of whatever mission drove the dog. Rex's barking became more urgent, alternating between sharp, insistent barks and that high-pitched whining that made Eric's chest tighten with concern. The dog looked back at Eric with eyes that seemed to plead for understanding, for help, for Eric to do something immediately to address whatever crisis Rex perceived. Eric examined the car more closely, his military training automatically kicking in to assess potential threats before getting too close. Years of clearing buildings in Afghanistan had taught him to be cautious around abandoned structures and vehicles. IEDs could be hidden anywhere, and abandoned cars were a favorite concealment method for insurgents. His rational mind knew he was in Virginia, not Kandahar, but his body didn't always remember the difference. His heart rate increased, his breathing sharpened, and he felt the familiar prickle of hypervigilance that his therapist was helping him recognize and manage. The car was a Honda Accord, probably from the mid-'80s based on the body style, boxy and utilitarian, from an era before curved lines and aerodynamic design became standard. Its blue paint had faded to a dull, lifeless gray where it hadn't been completely consumed by rust. The oxidation was extensive, creating a mottled pattern across the hood and roof where moisture and time had eaten away at the protective coating. The chrome trim that had most provided elegant accents had tarnished to a flat, lifeless finish, and in many places had simply fallen off, leaving mounting holes and adhesive residue. The windows were cloudy with years of accumulated grime, pollen, and moisture, creating an opaque barrier that made it impossible to see inside. Spiderwebs stretched across the side mirrors and door handles, their intricate patterns suggesting months or even years without human disturbance. The tires were completely flat, the rubber rotted away in places to expose the steel belts underneath. In some spots, the tires had disintegrated entirely, leaving the wheel rims sitting directly on the asphalt. Rust had eaten through the wheel wells and lower door panels like mechanical cancer, creating jagged holes that revealed the hollow interior of the door cavities. Leaves and debris had piled up around the base of the vehicle in drifts that suggested multiple seasons of accumulation. Vines from the nearby hedges had begun growing over the rear bumper and up the trunk lid, thin green tendrils that would eventually, given enough time, cover the entire vehicle. The car looked like it had been sitting in this exact spot for years, maybe even a decade, slowly deteriorating and being absorbed back into the landscape, forgotten by everyone who passed by daily without really seeing it. "What is it, boy? What's in there?" Eric asked again, his concern growing with each passing second. In 3 years together, through countless panic attacks, nightmares, physical therapy sessions, and challenging situations, Rex had never behaved this way, never ignored commands, never broke from his training, never showed this kind of frantic desperation. Something inside that car was important, critically important, and Rex was trying to communicate that truth with every fiber of his being, using the only language available to him: urgent action and persistent vocalization. Eric tried the driver's side door handle first, wrapping his fingers around the metal lever and pulling. It didn't budge even slightly. The mechanism was completely frozen, seized solid by rust and corrosion after years of exposure to the elements. Eric pulled harder, using both hands and bracing his prosthetic foot against the doorframe for leverage, but the handle might as well have been welded in place. He examined the lock button, a small knob that should protrude from the top of the door panel, but found it was corroded beyond function, just a small nub of oxidized metal that crumbled slightly when he touched it. "Locked tight," Eric muttered, moving around to the passenger side. His prosthetic made navigating the uneven ground challenging. The parking lot had developed cracks and potholes over the years, and the area around the car was overgrown with weeds and covered in fallen branches. Each step required conscious attention to avoid catching his artificial foot on obstacles or losing his balance on the uncertain terrain. Rex followed so closely that he actually stepped on Eric's heels twice, nearly tripping him as they navigated around the vehicle. The dog pressed against Eric's legs, simultaneously urging him forward and staying as close as possible, as if afraid that Eric might give up and walk away if Rex didn't maintain constant physical contact. The passenger side of the car was in marginally better condition than the driver's side, protected somewhat from the prevailing winds and weather by the car's orientation relative to the hedges. The paint was still faded, but not quite as corroded, and the door handle appeared slightly more intact. Eric tried this door as well, wrapping both hands around the handle and pulling with steady pressure. The mechanism inside clicked faintly, suggesting it was at least partially functional, but the door itself remained stuck, sealed by years of rust between the door and frame. Eric braced his prosthetic foot more firmly against the car's rocker panel and pulled with greater force, his muscles straining, his hands turning white with effort. The door resisted stubbornly for a long moment, making no sound, giving no indication that it would ever open. But then, suddenly, something inside gave way. The door made a horrible shrieking sound, metal grinding against rusted metal. A noise so loud it echoed across the parking lot and caused several park visitors to turn and stare. But the door still wouldn't open more than an inch. Eric could see now that the hinges were the problem. Corroded so badly they'd practically fused together, resisting movement with the stubbornness of metal that hadn't moved in years. He worked the door back and forth, opening and closing it in tiny increments, each movement accompanied by that awful grinding shriek, gradually working the hinges loose. As Eric worked, he peered through the narrow gap he'd created, trying to see inside. The smell that emerged was musty, but oddly not unpleasant. A mixture of old leather and fabric, motor oil, gun oil, and something else he couldn't quite identify. It triggered something in his memory, a familiarity he couldn't place, like déjà vu or a dream half remembered upon waking. After several minutes of patient work, the door finally opened wide enough to be useful, swinging back with a final screech of protest. The interior was surprisingly intact despite the exterior's condition. The dashboard, though cracked and faded to a sun-bleached gray, was complete with all its buttons and vents still in place. The steering wheel's leather wrap had deteriorated and split, exposing the hard plastic underneath, but the wheel itself remained solid and intact. The seats were covered in cracked vinyl. Their original blue color faded to a pale gray blue, with splits and tears that exposed yellowed foam padding underneath. Fast food wrappers littered the floor. Burger King, McDonald's, places that still existed but whose logos had changed since these wrappers were printed. The paper had faded and become brittle, suggesting they'd been there for many years. An old air freshener in the shape of a pine tree still hung from the rearview mirror, though whatever scent it once held had long since evaporated, leaving only the cardboard shape behind. The glove compartment hung open, empty except for a few ancient napkins and what looked like an expired registration from the 1990s. Rex didn't wait for Eric to finish his examination or for permission to enter. The moment the door opened wide enough to accommodate his body, Rex launched himself into the car's interior with explosive energy that rocked the entire vehicle on its deteriorated suspension. The dog landed on the passenger seat, which groaned and sagged under his weight, springs protesting audibly after years of disuse. Without any pause or hesitation, Rex immediately jumped from the front seat into the back, his movements frantic and purposeful, driven by whatever compulsion had brought them to this abandoned car in the first place. The back seat area was in even worse condition than the front. The upholstery was almost completely destroyed, torn and rotted until the seat's internal structure was fully exposed. Metal springs, wooden support frames, and chunks of disintegrated foam padding that had turned to dust. Rex didn't seem to notice or care about the sharp metal edges and potential hazards. He began digging at something wedged between the front seats, something wrapped in dark fabric that Eric couldn't quite see from his position outside the car. "Rex, stop! You're going to hurt yourself," Eric called out, genuinely worried now about the rusted springs and sharp metal edges that could easily cut or puncture Rex's paws or face. But the dog ignored him completely, just as he'd ignored every command since first spotting this car. Rex pulled at the fabric-wrapped object with his teeth, gentle despite his urgency, trying to extract whatever was hidden there without damaging it. The dog's training in careful retrieval was still functioning, even while his obedience training seemed to have completely shut down. Eric climbed into the car after Rex, the confined space making the maneuver difficult and painful for someone with a prosthetic leg. He had to brace himself against the door frame with both hands, carefully position his artificial leg to avoid catching it on the seat mechanisms or floor debris, and essentially haul himself into the back seat through sheer upper body strength. His residual limb protested the awkward movements, sending sharp pains through the scarred tissue where his leg ended and the prosthetic began. Once inside, Eric could see more clearly what had captured Rex's complete attention. Wedged tightly between the front bucket seats, deliberately hidden in that narrow space, was an object wrapped in what looked like an old military jacket. The jacket's camouflage pattern was faded but recognizable, woodland pattern, the kind the U.S. military had used for decades before switching to digital patterns. Rex was pulling at one corner of the jacket, trying to work it free from where it had been compressed into the tight space. Eric's heart began pounding harder, a sensation he'd learned to recognize as the precursor to anxiety. His therapist had taught him breathing techniques for moments like this, but his curiosity and Rex's intensity made it impossible to focus on measured breaths. He placed his hand on Rex's shoulder, feeling the trembling that ran through the dog's body like an electrical current. "Let me get it, boy. Easy now. Let me help." Eric worked his hands around the wrapped object, feeling its weight and substance. It was heavier than he'd expected, suggesting dense contents rather than just clothing or papers. The jacket had been wrapped around something substantial, something someone had taken care to protect and conceal. Eric pulled gently at first, testing how firmly it was wedged, then with increasing force as he realized how tightly it had been compressed into that narrow space between the seats. The object resisted his efforts, held in place by years of pressure and the way the seats had shifted and settled over time. Eric had to work it back and forth, gradually loosening it from its hiding place, pulling a few inches at a time. The fabric of the jacket was surprisingly intact despite its age, the military-grade material designed to withstand harsh conditions, still doing its job decades after it had been manufactured. Finally, after several minutes of careful maneuvering, the object came free. Eric pulled it into the better light streaming through the rear window, which was slightly less grimy than the others, and really looked at what Rex had been so desperate to find. It was, indeed, a military jacket wrapped around something rectangular and substantial. As Eric unfolded the jacket carefully, his breath caught in his throat, and the world seemed to tilt and spin around him. The jacket was Marine Corps issue, identical to the ones Eric himself had worn during his service. But it wasn't the jacket itself that made his hands begin trembling violently. It was the name, stenciled on the chest in black letters, faded with age, but still completely legible. The letters read, SSG Michael Thompson. Eric's hands froze completely, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Michael Thompson, his father's name, his father's exact rank. Staff Sergeant Michael Thompson, United States Marine Corps, who had deployed to Iraq in January 2006 and died there in August of the same year when Eric was just 10 years old. His father, who had been killed by an IED while on patrol, whose body had been returned home in a flag-draped coffin that Eric's mother had refused to let him see, saying she wanted him to remember his father as he had been, alive, smiling, strong. His father, whose personal effects had been lost somewhere in the chaos of war, lost in military bureaucracy or shipping mistakes or the general confusion that followed combat deaths. His mother had filed paperwork for years, had called military offices and written letters and filled out forms, all trying to recover whatever items her husband had left behind. She'd been told the items were lost, probably destroyed in the same attack that killed him, that there was nothing to recover, that she should give up hope of ever receiving them. But that was impossible. How could his father's jacket be here, in an abandoned car in a Virginia park, hundreds of miles from where Michael Thompson had died? How could his father's belongings have ended up wedged between the seats of a Honda Accord that looked like it had been abandoned for a decade or more? Eric's rational mind raced through possible explanations, each one seeming more implausible than the last. Military mix-up? Stolen items? Someone with the same name? But Staff Sergeant was a specific rank, and Michael Thompson wasn't exactly a rare name, but the combination seemed too precise to be coincidence. With trembling hands that felt disconnected from his body, hands that shook so badly he worried about dropping what he held, Eric carefully unwrapped the jacket to reveal what it had been protecting all these years. Inside was a military backpack, the kind every service member was issued, made of heavy olive drab canvas with reinforced stitching and metal hardware. This particular backpack showed signs of age and use, scuff marks, slight discoloration, stress points where the fabric had been stretched, but was still in remarkably good condition, protected by the jacket that had been wrapped around it. Eric set the jacket aside gently, treating it with the reverence it deserved as his father's uniform, and focused on the backpack. The main compartment was closed with a heavy-duty zipper, the kind designed to withstand field conditions and rough handling. His hands shook so violently as he reached for the zipper pull that it took him 3 attempts to grasp it properly. The zipper was stiff with age and disuse, the metal teeth slightly corroded, but it was functional. Eric pulled slowly, carefully, terrified that forcing it might damage whatever was inside. The zipper made a scratching sound as the teeth separated, and gradually the backpack opened to reveal its contents, items that confirmed Eric's impossible, overwhelming realization and shattered any remaining doubt about whose belongings these were. The first thing Eric saw, lying on top of everything else like a guardian watching over treasures below, was a pair of military dog tags. He lifted them with shaking fingers, the metal still shining despite years in storage, protected from oxidation by the sealed backpack and wrapped jacket. The embossed letters pressed into the metal were perfectly legible, each character stamped with military precision. Thompson, Michael J. Below that, his father's social security number. Then his blood type, O positive, and his religious preference, Methodist. These were the tags his father had worn every single day in the desert, The tags that should have been around his neck when he died, that should have been used to identify his body, that should have been sent home to his widow along with the folded flag. Eric held them up, watching them spin slowly on their chain, catching the morning light streaming through the dirty window. He pressed them to his own chest, feeling the cold metal against his skin through his shirt, trying to connect across the 17 years that separated him from the father he'd lost. A journal came next, pulled carefully from the backpack's main compartment. It was a standard military notebook, the kind sold at every PX and base exchange around the world. Green canvas cover, wire spiral binding, lined pages inside. Eric recognized the type immediately because he'd used dozens of them during his own service, writing after-action reports and personal notes and letters home during quiet moments between operations. This particular journal was worn at the edges from handling, the corners bent and softened, the cover slightly faded from exposure to sunlight and sand. Written on the cover in black permanent marker, in handwriting Eric recognized with a jolt of visceral emotion, were the words M. Thompson, Iraq 2006. The sight of that familiar handwriting, preserved perfectly across 17 years, made Eric's vision blur with tears that he couldn't control and didn't try to stop. His father's handwriting. The same handwriting that had appeared on birthday cards when Eric was young, on notes left on the refrigerator, on the inscription inside the baseball his father had given him before deploying, "Hit a home run for me, champ. Love, Dad." That baseball was still in Eric's childhood bedroom at his mother's house, one of the few physical reminders they had of Michael Thompson. Photographs spilled out next as Eric continued exploring the backpack's contents. A cascade of images that documented a life Eric had only known in fragments. Pictures of Eric as a baby, wrinkled and red-faced in hospital blankets. Pictures of him as a toddler, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a toy truck. School photos from kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Formal portraits where Eric had been forced to sit still and smile, his hair neatly combed, wearing his best clothes. Eric's hands moved through the photographs with increasing emotion, each image a window into memories he'd thought were lost forever. There were pictures of Eric's mother, too, Karen Thompson, young and beautiful, before grief had etched lines into her face and added gray to her hair. In these photos, she was vibrant and smiling, her eyes full of light and hope. One picture showed her in a sundress, standing in their backyard, laughing at something outside the frame. Another captured her and Michael together, his arm around her shoulders, both of them looking at the camera with the confident happiness of people who believed their future was secure. There was a family photo from Christmas 2005, the last holiday they'd all spent together before Michael deployed. Eric remembered that Christmas with painful clarity. He'd been 9 years old, excited about presents, but confused about why his father kept hugging him so tightly, why his mother's smile looked forced, why there was tension in the house despite the decorations and festivities. In the photo, they all stood in front of the Christmas tree, Michael in civilian clothes, Karen in a red sweater, Eric wearing a new shirt and holding a toy he'd just unwrapped. Everyone was smiling, but now Eric could see what he'd been too young to recognize then, the sadness in his father's eyes, the fear barely hidden behind his mother's smile, the impending deployment that hung over everything like a shadow. Letters followed, pulled carefully from a side pocket of the backpack. At least a dozen envelopes, all addressed to Karen Thompson at their home address, in the careful handwriting Eric now recognized as his father's. These were letters his father had written to his mother, letters that had never been mailed for reasons Eric couldn't understand, letters containing words his mother had never received, conversations that had never happened, thoughts and feelings that had been locked away in this hidden backpack for 17 years. Eric felt like an intruder holding these letters, touching intimate communications meant for his mother's eyes alone. But he also felt an overwhelming need to understand, to know his father better, to hear the voice he'd been missing for most of his life. He carefully opened one envelope dated March 2006, a few months into his father's deployment. "My dearest Karen," the letter began, and Eric had to stop reading for a moment, overcome by the tenderness in those 3 words. "I'm writing this after a long patrol. sitting in my bunk while the other guys play cards and joke around. I should be sleeping. We've got another mission tomorrow at dawn, but I can't stop thinking about you, about home, about Eric, about the life we built together, and how desperately I want to get back to it. The letter continued. I know my regular letters try to keep things light, try not to worry you too much, but I need to write this down somewhere, and you're the only person who would understand. I'm scared, Karen. Not of dying exactly, though that thought crosses my mind daily. I'm scared of missing Eric's childhood. I'm scared he'll grow up without really knowing me. I'm scared you'll have to raise him alone. I'm scared of becoming a memory instead of a father. Eric's tears fell freely now, dropping onto the aged paper, and he carefully tilted the letter away to avoid damaging his father's words. He'd never known his father felt this way, had never imagined the strong, confident Marine he remembered had harbored such fears and doubts. But then I remember why I'm here, his father had written. I'm here so Eric can grow up in a world that's a little bit safer, a little bit better. I'm here because Marines don't run from hard things. I'm here because service matters, because sacrifice means something. And I hold on to that when the fear gets too loud. I hold on to you and Eric and the belief that what I'm doing here matters. Eric couldn't read any more of that letter. He carefully folded it and returned it to its envelope, making a mental note to give all these letters to his mother. She needed to read them, needed to know what her husband had been thinking and feeling, needed to receive these words that had been stolen from her by whatever circumstances had hidden this backpack away. Then Eric saw it, and his heart stopped completely. Tucked into a smaller front pocket of the backpack was something that made a sound escape his throat that was half sob, half laugh. A small teddy bear, worn and faded, its brown fur matted and slightly discolored, but unmistakably the same bear Eric had given his father before deployment. Eric remembered that moment with excruciating clarity, one of the few memories from that period of his life that hadn't been blurred by time and childhood confusion. It had been January 2006, early morning at the airport. Eric had been 9 years old, trying so hard to be brave like his father had asked, fighting back tears because Marine sons didn't cry. But as the final boarding call came, Eric had broken down, pressing his favorite teddy bear into his father's hands. "To keep you safe, Daddy," Eric had said through his tears, "so you remember to come home to me. Promise you'll keep him with you always." His father had knelt down to Eric's level, ignoring the urgency of the boarding call, and pulled him into a fierce hug. "I promise, champ. I promise I'll keep him safe, and he'll keep me safe, and I'll bring him home to you when I come back. That's a promise from a Marine, and Marines never break their promises." Eric had never seen that bear again after his father deployed. When his father's body came home, when the folded flag was presented to his mother, when the military officers expressed their condolences, Eric had asked about the bear. His mother had told him gently that it was lost, that sometimes things got lost in war, that the bear had done its job by keeping Daddy company even if it couldn't bring him home. But here it was, 17 years later, in Eric's trembling hands. His father had kept his promise. Michael Thompson had kept that bear with him, had protected it, had carried it through combat operations and desert heat, had made sure it survived even though he hadn't. Eric clutched the worn teddy bear to his chest and wept, his shoulders shaking, his grief as fresh and raw as the day he'd learned his father wasn't coming home. Rex pressed closer, his solid warmth providing comfort, his presence anchoring Eric to the present even as the past overwhelmed him. The dog placed his head on Eric's lap, his brown eyes full of understanding that transcended species, offering the same patient support he'd provided during countless panic attacks and nightmares over the past 3 years. After several minutes, Eric's breathing steadied enough for him to continue exploring the backpack's contents. He found more photographs, more letters, more pieces of his father's life preserved like artifacts from an archaeological dig. But it was another sealed envelope that made Eric's hands start shaking again, this one different from all the others. This envelope wasn't addressed to Karen Thompson. It was addressed in his father's distinctive handwriting to Eric Thompson. Open when you're old enough to understand. The envelope was slightly thicker than the others, suggesting multiple pages inside, and it had been sealed with extra care, the flap reinforced with clear tape to ensure it would remain closed until the intended recipient opened it. Eric stared at that envelope for a long moment, his name written in his father's hand, a message sent across 17 years specifically for him. His father had written this knowing he might die, knowing Eric might someday need to hear words that couldn't be spoken face to face, knowing that a boy who'd lost his father would eventually become a man who needed guidance from beyond the grave. With shaking hands that made the paper rattle, Eric carefully opened the envelope, mindful of the aged tape and paper. Inside were 3 pages, covered front and back in his father's neat handwriting, dated August 14, 2006, just 2 days before Michael Thompson died in that IED blast. 2 days before Eric's world shattered. 2 days before everything changed. "Dear Eric," his father had written, and Eric could barely see the words through his tears. "If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. I'm sorry, son. I'm so incredibly, profoundly sorry. I'm sorry I won't be there to teach you to drive, to help you with homework, to give you advice about girls, to see you graduate, to watch you become a man. I'm sorry I broke the promise I made at the airport, the promise to come home to you and bring your bear back safely." Eric had to stop, unable to continue reading through the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him completely. He pressed his father's letter to his chest, next to the teddy bear, surrounded by the physical evidence of his father's love, and let himself grieve in a way he hadn't allowed himself since he was 10 years old. "But I need you to know something important," the letter continued when Eric could force himself to keep reading. "My death, if it comes, is not a tragedy to be mourned forever. It's a sacrifice I made willingly, proudly, for a cause I believed in with my whole heart. Don't let it define you, Eric. Don't let it make you bitter or angry or afraid of the world. Don't let my death stop you from living fully, from taking risks, from being happy, from loving deeply. The worst thing you could do, the thing that would truly break my heart, is to live a small, scared life because you're afraid of losing what you love. I didn't die so you could be afraid. I died so you could be free." Eric read those words again and again, letting them sink into the wounded places in his soul. For 3 years since returning from Afghanistan, since losing his leg and watching his brothers die, Eric had been living exactly the kind of small, scared life his father was warning against. He'd isolated himself, pushed away friends and potential relationships, refused to take chances or pursue dreams because opening himself up to joy felt like inviting more loss. He'd been so afraid of experiencing more pain that he'd stopped really living at all, just existing in a gray space between survival and actual life. "I see so much potential in you, Eric," his father had written, the words speaking across 17 years with startling relevance. "Even at 9 years old, I can see the man you're going to become. You're kind and curious and brave in ways you don't even realize yet. You feel things deeply. I see it in how you care for your friends, how you defend kids who get picked on at school, how you cried when we had to put our old dog to sleep. That's not weakness, son. That's strength." The ability to feel deeply, to care profoundly, to love without reservation, that's what makes life worth living. Eric thought about the walls he'd built around himself since Afghanistan, the emotional barriers that kept everyone at arm's length. His therapist had been gently pushing him to open up more, to consider dating again, to reconnect with old friends he'd been avoiding. But Eric had resisted, convinced that caring about people just meant having more to lose when the inevitable happened and they left or died or disappeared from his life. His father's words challenged that belief directly, suggesting that the risk of loss was worth taking for the reward of genuine connection. "Whatever you become, whatever path you choose, I'm already proud of you," the letter continued. "You don't have to be a Marine like your old man. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. You don't have to follow in my footsteps or live up to some image of who you think I wanted you to be. If you want to be a teacher, be a teacher. If you want to be an artist, be an artist. If you want to work with your hands or your mind or your heart, do that. Just be good at whatever you choose. Just be kind. Just be you. That's enough. That's everything. Eric had joined the Marines partly to honor his father's memory, partly because he genuinely believed in service, but also partly because he thought it was what his father would have wanted. He'd never questioned whether there might have been other paths equally valid, other ways to make his father proud. Now, with his combat career over because of his injuries, Eric had been struggling with feelings of failure, of having been unable to complete what he'd started. But his father's words suggested that service took many forms, that there was no single correct path to a meaningful life. Find what makes you happy and do that, his father had written. Find people who love you and hold on to them. Build a life full of meaning and joy and purpose. Don't just survive, Eric. Thrive. Laugh often. Take chances. Travel. Fall in love. Really love someone with your whole heart, even though it's scary, even though they might leave or die or break your heart. Love anyway. That's how you honor my memory, by living well, by living fully, by squeezing every drop of beauty and joy and meaning out of this precious, brief life we get. The letter's next section was addressed to more practical matters, and Eric could hear his father's voice shifting into the problem-solving mode he remembered from childhood. Take care of your mother, Eric. She's stronger than she knows, stronger than she believes, but losing me will be hard on her. She'll probably try to hide her grief to protect you, try to be strong for your sake. Don't let her carry that burden alone. Be her strength when she needs it. Let her cry on your shoulder. Listen when she wants to talk about me, and help her find happiness again someday. If she meets someone else, someone who treats her well and makes her smile, support that. Don't hold on to grief so tightly that it prevents healing. She deserves to be happy. You both do. Eric thought about his mother, who had indeed tried to shield him from the worst of her grief, who had maintained strength and composure even when Eric knew she was falling apart inside. She'd never remarried, never even dated as far as Eric knew, and he'd never asked or encouraged her to consider it. Maybe he'd been unconsciously holding on to his father's memory so tightly that he'd prevented both of them from fully healing and moving forward. And take care of yourself, his father continued. Be gentle with yourself when you make mistakes, because you will make them. Everyone does. Learn from them, grow from them, but don't let them define you. Forgive yourself. That's something I'm still learning to do, and I wish I'd learned it earlier. We're all imperfect people doing our best in a complicated world. That's enough. You are enough, exactly as you are. The letter's conclusion brought fresh tears to Eric's eyes, tears that mixed grief with gratitude, loss with love, pain with a strange sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. Remember that I'm not really gone, Eric. I'm in every lesson I taught you, every value I tried to instill, every moment we shared together. I'm in your memories of throwing a baseball in the backyard, of building that treehouse that leaned slightly to the left, of the camping trips where we burned the hot dogs and laughed about it. I'm in your sense of right and wrong, in your compassion for others, in your strength and resilience. Love doesn't end, Eric. It just changes form. It becomes memory and legacy and the ways we influence each other's lives even after we're physically gone. I'll be with you at your high school graduation, your wedding, the birth of your children. Not physically, but in the values I gave you, in the love I had for you, in the part of me that lives on in you. You carry me forward into the future I won't get to see. And that's a kind of immortality that matters more than any monument or medal. The final paragraph made Eric clutch the letter tightly, pressing it against his heart alongside the teddy bear. I love you, son. I loved you from the moment I first held you as a baby, and I'll love you long after I'm gone. Forever and always, in this world and whatever comes next. Be brave, be kind, be happy. Live the life I would have wanted for you, the life I fought to protect. That's all I ask. That's everything. Your dad. Eric sat in that rusted car for what might have been minutes or hours, Time lost all meaning as he absorbed his father's words, as he processed 17 years of grief and questions and loss through the lens of this unexpected gift. Rex remained pressed against him throughout, patient and steady, occasionally licking Eric's hand or pressing his nose against Eric's arm, providing the grounding presence that had become his specialty over 3 years as a service dog. Finally, when Eric's tears had slowed and his breathing had steadied, when the immediate storm of emotion had passed, leaving behind a strange calm, he carefully gathered everything back into the backpack. The journal he would read fully later, every word, every entry. The photographs he would share with his mother would get properly preserved and framed. The letters to his mother he would deliver personally, would watch her face as she read words meant for her eyes 17 years ago. The teddy bear would find a place of honor in his home, a tangible reminder of promises kept even across death. But the letter addressed to him, his father's final words of guidance and love, Eric folded carefully and placed in his jacket pocket, close to his heart. Those words would stay with him, would be reread in quiet moments when doubt crept in, would serve as a compass pointing toward the kind of life his father had wanted for him, a life full of courage and kindness and joy despite loss. Eric emerged from the car slowly, his prosthetic stiff from sitting in the cold for so long, his face wet with tears he didn't try to hide. Rex walked beside him, calm now, his urgent mission completed, his desperate need satisfied. The dog had led Eric to exactly what he needed, had refused to give up until Eric opened that door and found what waited inside. As Eric carefully loaded the backpack into his truck, treating it with the reverence it deserved, Rex jumped into the passenger seat and looked at him with those knowing brown eyes that seemed to hold understanding beyond what any normal dog should possess. "Thank you," Eric whispered, reaching over to scratch behind Rex's ears, to stroke the soft fur of the dog who'd given him this incredible gift. "I don't know how you knew what was in there, but thank you for not giving up. Thank you for making me open that door." Rex's tail wagged slowly, deliberately, and Eric would swear for the rest of his life that the dog understood every word, understood the magnitude of what had just happened, understood that he'd fulfilled some greater purpose beyond standard service dog duties. Eric called his mother from the truck, his voice still hoarse from crying, and told her he was coming over, that he'd found something impossible, something miraculous. He heard her sharp intake of breath, heard hope and fear warring in her voice as she asked what he'd found. "Dad's backpack," Eric said simply. "His journal, his letters to you, everything the military said was lost. I found it all, Mom. He's coming home. After 17 years, Dad is finally coming home." His mother's sobs carried clearly through the phone, and Eric heard crashes in the background as she presumably dropped whatever she'd been holding. "Come home right now," she managed through her tears. "Right now, Eric. I need to see it. I need to read his words. Oh God, after all these years." Driving toward his childhood home with his father's backpack secured beside him, Eric realized something profound that shifted his entire worldview. For 3 years, he'd thought Rex was his service dog, there to help him cope with PTSD and mobility challenges, to provide support and companionship through his recovery. But maybe Rex's purpose had been larger, more specific. Maybe Rex had been guided to Eric for this exact moment, to lead him to his father's lost belongings at precisely the time Eric was ready to receive them, when he needed them most desperately. Eric had been struggling with questions of meaning and purpose, battling survivor's guilt, wondering if his sacrifice in Afghanistan had been worth the cost. But his father's words, "Don't let it define you, live boldly, find joy, I'm proud of you," spoke directly to those questions with the authority of someone who'd faced similar struggles and come through with wisdom to share. His dog had refused to leave that old car's door because Rex somehow knew what Eric needed, what his father wanted Eric to have. And when Eric finally opened it, he couldn't stop crying because inside was more than objects and papers. Inside was closure, validation, love transcending death, and permission from his father to live fully despite loss. Inside was the gift of his father's voice speaking clearly across 17 years of silence, telling him everything he needed to hear at exactly the moment he needed to hear it. As Eric pulled into his mother's driveway and saw her standing on the porch, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears already streaming down her face, he understood that Rex had given them both something precious beyond measure. Not just physical objects, but connection, healing, and the chance to finally say goodbye while also receiving permission to fully live again.